Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about From Beyond on Blu-ray and DVD. From Beyond was a horror film that was made in 1986 and was directed by Stuart Gordon, and it was a product of Empire Pictures. It was also based on a short story of the same name by horror author H.P. Lovecraft. That particular story was first written in 1920, but it wasn't published until 1934 in a magazine called The Fantasy Fan. So the very first time I saw From Beyond, I have to confess I was a bit disappointed in it. And part of that was because I was judging it by the, high bar that Stuart Gordon's previous film, Reanimator, had set. So just to give you all some background, Reanimator was a dark horror comedy that was also an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator. And the funny thing is that Reanimator was basically a parody of the H.P. Lovecraft story, but H.P. Lovecraft in turn had written that story as a parody of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So he had a movie that was a parody of a story that was a parody of another story. But as it happened, Reanimator turned out to be a smash hit and was a lightning in a bottle movie, wherein even though it was a low budget film, everything fell into place, to where you had a bona fide hit on the hands of, director Stuart Gordon, as well as the production company Empire Pictures. Because for both Empire Pictures and director Stuart Gordon, this was basically the best film that came from both of them. For director Stuart Gordon, even though he made some other good films to be sure, Reanimator to this day continues to be regarded as his one great film. And based on the films of his I've seen, I would have to agree. As far as Empire Pictures, that was a production company that specialized in low budget films, usually sci-fi or horror films. But some of these movies were made by people who were basically firing on all cylinders, and so even though they were working with a low budget, they were making the best effort they could to make a good movie, something that would rise above their B-movie limitations. And so as a result, you had some genuinely good movies that would come out of Empire Pictures from time to time. I mean, you also had a lot of schlock, but sometimes you had some good movies. And so Reanimator was definitely, what I would say was the equivalent of Citizen Kane for Empire Pictures, though. I mean, that's like the movie that, basically brought a lot of, awareness, to Empire Pictures, because a lot of mainstream, critics were singing Reanimator's praises. And so once that happened, it was kind of like a domino effect. Like, for a short period of time, there were some, mainstream, critics that, were, checking out, movies from Empire Pictures, and so as a result, there was a bit more visibility for that production company, for the amount of time that it lasted. But with From Beyond, though, they were kind of going for the idea of lightning striking twice, and unfortunately it didn't quite work out like that, because even though From Beyond had a lot of the same elements that were a part of making Reanimator the success that it was, From Beyond unfortunately did not succeed at the box office. The budget was somewhere between 2 and 3 million, but the overall box office take was $1,261,000. So even though it was a low budget movie, it still bombed at the box office. But as far as critical reception goes, there actually were quite a few critics that liked the movie. It just didn't make a lot of money at the box office, unfortunately. So over time, though, it's found a home with horror audiences, because it took a while for this film to be released, to where a lot of people could see it. And I mean, sure enough, it was available on VHS, but it took a while for it to be available on DVD. And then finally they came out with the Blu-ray. So with it being available on Blu-ray, especially with this Blu-ray and DVD combo pack, I think it's cool that it's being brought to the attention of a growing audience. And so, seeing as how horror films from the 80s are always getting more fans, and so From Beyond is definitely a worthy addition to this newly growing fan base for 80s horror. But as far as it being an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft, it's rather unique because the original short story, From Beyond, if I remember correctly, was only 6 or 7 pages long. And so the first few minutes of this movie are actually a fairly faithful adaptation of the short story. But if this movie was strictly an adaptation of that short story, you'd have a very short movie. So what ends up happening is that the first few minutes are a faithful adaptation of the short story, albeit set in a modern setting, which would be the 1980s. But after those first few minutes, it becomes its own thing, and as a result, I think that we have something that starts off as an H.P. Lovecraft adaptation, and then it becomes Lovecraftian, if that makes any sense, because from after those first few minutes, I mean, we're getting plot developments that are wholly original and what have you, as well as characters that are wholly original as well. But I think that another reason that I didn't particularly like this movie the first time I saw it was probably because around this particular time, I guess you could say, while I've always liked horror films, but when it came to, say, real life, there were a lot of things I was kind of naive and innocent on at this point in time. And even though I had seen Reanimator already, and Reanimator is a pretty gruesome and transgressive movie, but something about Reanimator, though, made it to where even if one was fairly sheltered, they could still enjoy the movie because it had just the right balance of, comedy and horror, and sometimes it just, totally obliterated the line altogether. But because of how well fleshed out the main characters were, it once again spoke to the movie's universal appeal. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even though I was in a point in life where I was very naive and sheltered, I still very much enjoyed that movie, as transgressive as it was. Whereas when I saw From Beyond, I mean, one, I was judging it by the high standards that Reanimator had set, and I was disappointed in that regard because, I guess I was expecting another Reanimator. And two, there's a certain element of transgressiveness that kind of carries over from Reanimator to this movie, but in different ways. I felt like it was kind of over the top, and it was like I felt like they were trying too hard to make a connection between sex and horror, or dark psychology and horror and sexuality as well. But over time, though, I guess because I've lived life more, I guess you could say, gotten out more, interacted with people more, read a lot more, listened to interviews and things like that. I've come to realize that the way the movie's transgressive elements are portrayed, while they may be extreme at times, they're not exactly unrealistic. Because for example, we all have sides of ourselves that we keep it hidden or repressed, and but every now and then these dark sides come out. And so one of the things about From Beyond was that there's a machine in the movie that basically acts to overstimulate people that are around it or operating it, and so this deviant behavior, it's not as, shall we say, shoehorned in as I thought that it was the first time I watched it, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening that's outside the main character's control, and so when we come to realize that we all have a dark side to us that comes out every now and then, and sometimes these darker sides are more disturbing than others. Well, From Beyond, doesn't come across as that unfeasible within the realms of horror. And so the second time I watched it, which was recently, I came away appreciating the movie that much more. And sure enough, some of the transgressiveness does veer into the over-the-top territory, but at the same time, it doesn't come across as unrealistic, at least as far as depicting the dark side of human nature being brought out through bizarre circumstances. But yeah, I ended up enjoying the movie more the second time around, and I guess also just because I was older and a little less naive about certain things. And so I'm not going to say From Beyond was a great movie like Reanimator was, but it is a good movie though. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the story kicks off with these two characters named Dr. Edward Pretorius and his assistant, who's a physicist named Crawford Tillinghast. And make sure. Tillinghast, sorry. Crawford Tillinghast. And the two of them have created a machine called the Resonator. And the purpose of this machine is to tap into it's meant to open up the barriers in between dimensions, because we all are given 5 senses, but at the same time there's still so much that we don't know about, or so much that we can't perceive with these 5 senses. So this machine basically allows us to see what's beyond these senses, and namely it opens a doorway to a dimension wherein there are other creatures present, but because these barriers have been lifted, if while we can see these creatures, they in turn can see or sense us. And unfortunately, said creatures are more than a little hostile. And as the movie opens up, Crawford is testing the Resonator. He's got all the computers up and running, and he turns the machine on, and it starts to stimulate him, to the point where he becomes very aware of his, like extra aware when it comes to sensory input and what have you. And he starts to kind of get I guess you could say, overly stimulated because of the machine's emanations. But then, he's able to see into this other dimension, and it in turn, is able to be in ours at the same time, and in this limited space. And there's this floating, creature. It looks like a worm with sharp teeth. And at first it's just, sort of swimming around in this, space above him. And then it attacks him, and it actually takes a bite out of his cheek. And so while he's trying to fight it off, he turns the machine off. He turns the Resonator off. And so everything's back to normal. But yeah, he still got a bite taken out of his cheek. And so he, goes to the bedroom where Dr. Pretorius is, and knocks on a door, and he's saying, hey, you need to come see this. The machine worked. And so Pretorius, he kind of storms out. He's like, you better not be joking. And so the two of them, they go to where the Resonator is, and Pretorius turns it on, and Crawford's manning the computers. But once the Resonator's activated, the same thing happens, in the sense that both Crawford and Pretorius start to become overly stimulated with their senses, and suddenly, all sorts of other things start to happen, such as the computer starts to run itself as opposed to being operated by Crawford. And he's telling Pretorius to turn the machine off, because Pretorius is standing over where the machine is, and there's like the on and off switch, and Crawford's trying to turn it off from the computers, but a lot of the systems start to blow up, and so it's out of his control, and he's begging for Pretorius to shut it down, because the stimulation is becoming too much. And the fact that the computer was running itself, I mean, is something like that was unforeseen. The fact that something from the other side is playing havoc with the systems on our side. And so Pretorius, I mean, he's basically having this sensory orgasm. That's the best way I can describe it, because he's physically ecstatic, and he's saying, no, I have to see more, I have to know more, I have to know it all, I have to feel it all, I have to be it all. And basically, I mean, he's being exposed to everything, and he's wanting more. But then suddenly he stops, and he looks, about him, and he says, "Something's coming." And then it cuts to a neighbor across the way who's calling the police, because as she's looking outside her window, there's all these violet lights that are, bursting out of the house where Pretorius and Crawford are at, and windows are shattering. And she's calling the police, saying, those scientists are, doing something, that's, destroying the house. You need to come right away. And so while the police send a squad car over, the lady's dog gets out, and so she follows the dog to that house. And right when she gets her dog, and it's right in front of the door where the resonator of the room where the resonator is. But right when she gets the dog, this axe comes bursting through from the other side, and then a terrified Crawford, forces the door open and runs out, past the lady. And she's freaking out, he's freaking out, and he runs outside the house and into the arms of the arriving police. And because he's resisting arrest, I mean, they see him as a threat and arrest him, or because he's resisting them and he's trying to fight them off and he's freaking out, they arrest him. And then they in turn go into the house, following the lady for the neighbor lady, and they find her dog sitting with the body of Dr. Pretorius, except his head's gone, and it's licking at the bloody stump of where his head once was. And so if the movie then goes to a little bit later, and Crawford has been committed to a mental institution. And the authorities think he's batshit crazy or straight up lying about what happened to his mentor, Edward Pretorius, because he keeps telling these stories about how some kind of monsters have eaten him, or at least they killed him, or tried to eat him or something. And creatures that can only be seen when a certain machine's activated. And so naturally they're thinking he's crazy. But then this one doctor named Catherine McMichaels comes into the hospital, or to a mental institution, because she was actually a follower of the work of Edward Pretorius, and in the areas of sensory expansion. And basically she's wanting to know what happened to him, since Pretorius was someone that she looked up to. And she interviews Crawford, and he tells her what he's been telling the authorities and the hospital staff, that something came out of the other side and bit his head off, as in Dr. Pretorius's head off. And he did what he could to destroy the machine, and then he ran. So so Catherine She persuades the the mental institution's lead doctor to run a CAT scan on Crawford to see if there's anything abnormal about his brain, to see if like maybe there's some sort of chemical imbalance or some sort of abnormality that could conceivably explain his bizarre behavior, or say if he's genuinely delusional, why would he be having these why would he be seeing things that aren't there, and why did he kill Dr. Pretorius if that's what happened? And so they run a CAT scan on him, and only to find out that his pineal gland has become enlarged and is still growing. And so the pineal gland is basically this organ that produces melatonin, and which regulates your sleep. And it also this gland also influences certain like sex hormones and things like that. And so basically it's also been called the third eye by some people. And this 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes, I think is how you say his name, he called it the principal seat of the soul, which I guess in turn kind of led into the whole concept of the third eye. But okay, so anyway, the pineal gland is a real thing. It does exist. But for the purposes of this movie, all right, so they run the CAT scan and they find out that okay, something definitely happened, to result in, his pineal gland, growing and continuing to grow. And, so Dr. Block, the head of the place, and Dr. McMichaels, they're talking to, the chief of police about the situation, because Dr. Block is wanting to keep Crawford there and keep him, isolated and sedated. But Dr. McMichaels is pointing out that, whether he killed Dr. Pretorius or not, something had to have happened at that house to result in his pineal gland becoming enlarged, because it wasn't like that before. This research was done, and before this machine was supposedly activated. And so, she actually is persuading the chief of police to allow him to allow her to have custody of Crawford, and so the two of them can go back to Pretorius's house and retrace his steps. So maybe by doing so, he can come to terms with what happened, and maybe show her exactly what it was that resulted in his his pineal gland to become enlarged. And so seeing as how Pretorius was a highly held a highly respected member of the scientific community, and so there's like a bit of pressure there, the chief of police decides to allow for Dr. McMichaels to to have a shot at this idea, against Dr. Block's objections. And so he turns custody of Crawford over to Dr. McMichaels, but he insists on them being accompanied by a friend of his who's a detective on the force, a guy by the name of Detective Bubba, Bubba Brownlee. So. And Bubba, I mean, he's a nice guy and everything, but at the same time, there's a certain strength to him. Like, he's a big guy, but he also has this demeanor of, it's like, hey, you're cool with me, I'm cool with you, but you try anything, yeah. So basically, he's a nice guy, but don't push him, that kind of thing. So, Catherine and Bubba take Crawford in a van, over to Pretorius's place, and. At first, Crawford was very reluctant to go along with this, but, Dr. McMichaels, she was pointing out that, if you're wanting, the authorities and the doctors to believe you, you need to show us what happened. You need to show us exactly how this process started and what the result was, and basically retrace your steps and also confront the source of your trauma. So Crawford reluctantly goes along there, and the three of them, they go into the place, and Crawford's kind of showing them around, and then they kind of split up, and Bubba and Catherine, they find some very weird stuff in Dr. Pretorius's bedroom. So basically the guy was a huge S&M freak, and was very into extremes of sexuality, and like they find all sorts of paraphernalia, and like even a video of him whipping this naked woman. And so as Bubba was saying, this guy was into some weird shit, but Catherine's all like, I don't care about his private life, because she looked up to the guy for his for the stuff he did for the scientific community. So she doesn't really care about what he was like off his work hours. So the two of them leave the bedroom, and they find the room where the resonator is, which is when Crawford sort of comes screaming out of the shadows with an axe, and Bubba restrains him, and Crawford just drops the axe, and he apologizes, and he's like, I wasn't trying to attack you, I was trying to destroy it. And he's pointing at the resonator, and he shows him that there was a fork that was on top of it that he was able to knock off on that night, and he also did some other damage to it that resulted in the resonator being shut down. And so he's showing them everything, and he's telling them exactly what happened as he remembered it. And Catherine has the idea to basically repair the resonator and try and recreate the experiment, because once again she's going by the whole idea that something happened here that resulted in his pineal gland becoming enlarged, whereas other medical records show that it hadn't been beforehand. And so also she's wanting him to try and confront whatever happened, and maybe the truth will come out. And so Bubba, of course, he's willing to play along with all this, but at the same time, he's not quite keen on playing assistant to mad scientists or anything like that, but he's willing to go along because it's part of his job. So the three of them work together and repair the resonator, and they get ready to turn it on, and they had to improvise in some ways, because the computers had all been destroyed when it had first been turned on, or on that night when Pretorius had been taken. And so Crawford, before he turns the machine on manually, he's telling them, regardless of what you see, do not move, because if you can see them, they can see you. And he turns the machine on, and what first happens is all three of them are overly stimulated with their senses, and they, amongst other things, kind of become very aroused. And Crawford's having to sort of like force himself to calm down, and as well as Catherine, and he's trying to talk her down too. Whereas Bubba, he's experiencing this too, but he has a stronger will, partially due to his job as a law enforcement officer and the situations he's been in. You kind of get the idea that he has a stronger will when it comes to, say, having sort of a mental barrier on things, not to where he's unaffected, but at the same time he's able to hold out more than Crawford and Catherine are. But Then they see these jellyfish-like creatures kind of, floating around the room all of a sudden. So sure enough, the barriers between dimensions have been lowered, and now these creatures and them are on the same plane of existence. And Bubba, he looks at them and he's in awe of them because he'd never seen anything like this. And he breaks the rule of not moving, and suddenly one of these jellyfish-like creatures latches onto his arm and takes a chunk out of it, before they're able to get it off his arm, and Bubba stomps on it and crushes it. But so they're like, okay, we got to turn this off right now. And so Catherine's trying to help him get his arm patched up, and Crawford's about to turn the machine off when this voice comes from out of nowhere, saying like, Crawford. And it's Pretorius's voice. And Crawford's like, that's impossible, because he literally saw Pretorius's head get ripped off by something. And so sure enough, Pretorius though comes out of the shadows. I mean, looking vaguely human. I mean, he's human and everything, but there's like this gelatinous, stuff all over his body, and it's kind of shifting. And Crawford's like, I saw you die. And Pretorius is saying, a small price to pay for immortality. And he vaguely explains that when he was killed, somehow his consciousness crossed over to the other side and was able to connect with whatever was over there and becoming a whole new life form. And he basically tells Crawford to touch him if he's in doubt of his existence. And so Crawford reluctantly does so, while Catherine and Bubba look on. And as he touches Edward on his shoulder, his flesh sort of caves in just a little bit, and Crawford kind of sort of flinches back, and Pretorius starts cackling like a madman. And then he looks back at them and he peels his face off into where there's like this sort of reptilian looking face underneath where his skin was, and you see like these worm-like things sort of just start wriggling around on his face. And he's sort of just shaking his head. He's like, it's only a body. And then he just starts laughing again, and he literally starts to tear his own head apart, to the point where you see like his eyes and his skull just come apart. And Bubba picks up his gun and starts to shoot at the thing, and that's when all this violet blood and gore just starts pumping out of the stump where his head was. And you hear Pretorius's laughter the whole time, and suddenly this tentacled monstrosity just bursts out of the stump where all this violet blood and gore were coming out, and it lunges at all three of them, which is right when Crawford finally is able to get to the resonator and turn it off. And he's like, okay, that's enough. And so the three of them, they reconvene in the kitchen, and they're talking about their next plan of action. And so Crawford and Bubba are understandably ready to get the hell out of there, because I mean Crawford had a feeling of something happening, but he definitely wasn't expecting to see Pretorius again, let alone Pretorius being turned into something other than human. And Bubba, he was thinking that the resonator were just gonna have some fancy lights on it or something, but he wasn't expecting it to sort of overstimulate their senses, and two, he definitely wasn't expecting to make contact with something from another dimension. And the fact that it's a hostile dimension was something that was terrifying, let alone the fact that he had a chunk taken out of his arm by this other dimensional jellyfish creature. And so after his arm's been patched up and everything, but he and Crawford are insisting that the three of them leave, but Catherine's wanting to stay. And she's saying that yes, that was something that was a dangerous situation, but there's so much potential here. And she's saying how, I mean, it's proof that you and Pretorius, were working on something that had results. And, the fact that they were able to see into another dimension, vice versa, I mean, it's definitely something that should be further explored. And Crawford reluctantly, says that yes, I mean, there are potential merits, to this experiment, but it needs to be in a controlled environment and with a team of professionals. And Catherine's saying, but this is a controlled environment and we are professionals. And in a way, she's right, but realistically speaking, and from the standpoint of common sense, she's off her base, because I mean, this was clearly a situation that neither of them were prepared for, and it's a situation that definitely needs something in the way of extensive safeguards. And so, and she's trying to say, give an example of what this is the equivalent of. She's like, this is the equivalent of when, so-and-so first, saw an amoeba in a microscope for the first time. And that's when, Bubba kind of chimes in and says, yeah, but he wasn't in there with the amoeba, kind of like we were, And so finally, though, she kind of comes clean and admits that, she has a personal reason for wanting to see this experiment, continue, is because she's convinced that it could be a cure to curing schizophrenia, because, her father spent the last 15 years of his life in a mental institution because of schizophrenia. And so she just saw him, gradually die day by day. I mean, after electroshock treatment and medication that just turned him into a zombie, it was no longer her father. And so, and she's theorizing that, people who are schizophrenic may very well be in some way exposed to, this other dimension, to where they can see it, of course, but no one else can. And so it kind of, messes with their minds, to a point where, we're seeing them interact with something that, as far as we can tell, isn't there, but they're interacting with something that only they can see. And so, she's wanting to continue this experiment because, she's wanting to, help other people who are schizophrenic. And so, once more, they're like, okay, yeah, we get where you're coming from, but we are out of our depth here. So, we need to, get out of here. And if we're going to continue this experiment, we need to bring in some professionals, or we need to, bring this machine with have this machine brought somewhere where, it's a safe environment or a controlled environment. And so, Catherine, though, she's reluctant to just depart right then and there, because they're all, tired and stressed out from everything. And so, she's like, okay, let's just sleep on it. Let's just, spend the night here. And then in the morning, if you two want to go, we'll go. And as tired as they are, they're like, okay, we'll stay here, but no more. And sure enough, morning comes along. And while Crawford and Bubba are, sleeping in these guest bedrooms, Catherine, she wakes up and takes it upon herself to, go to the Resonator and turn it on herself. And sure enough, she once more becomes overly stimulated to a point where she's becoming aroused and everything. And then suddenly, the other two are made aware of it too, because they're feeling the emanations of the Resonator. And Crawford makes it up to where the Resonator is first, and he sees Catherine there, and he's telling her to turn it off, but she starts echoing Pretorius, saying, I have to see more, I have to know more, I have to feel more. And before Crawford can make a go at turning the machine off himself, Pretorius manifests again, but this time it's a different physical state. And he at this point begins to molest Catherine, and he forcibly brings her over to him with these elongated arms, and he starts to try and have his way with her. And Crawford just kind of runs off in terror, and Pretorius is laughing like a maniac the whole time, saying, "We'll be waiting for you, Crawford." And but he and Bubba, once they bump into each other downstairs, they head down to the basement, where the cables for the resonator are connected to the generator. But as they get to the basement, the whole place has been flooded by this violet strange water that wasn't there before, but it's seeping over from this other dimension. And there's this worm-like creature that's swimming around in the water, like this huge worm that has like these sharp teeth, and it starts to attack them. And they both try to get to the generator and disengage the cables, but the water's splashing them all around, or knocking them from side to side. And then the worm starts to attack Crawford, and it starts to devour him. And Bubba, goes back upstairs and grabs a butcher knife and starts to, try and, stab the creature. And that doesn't really seem to do anything other than making it mad. And so, he, breaks off, and he, tries to make it to the generator himself. And he is able to disengage the cables, which results in everything going back to normal. The water's suddenly gone, that worm creature's gone, but Crawford falls to the ground, having multiple bite marks on him, and now his hair's gone. And upstairs, Catherine's freaking out, because even though Pretorius isn't there anymore, I mean, she's clearly just been violated, and she's breaking down in hysterics and tears. And so Bubba, he carries Crawford upstairs, and when he gets to Catherine, they're all like, "Okay, we need to get out of here. If nothing else, we need to get Crawford some help." And Catherine's she's like, "Okay, now we need to go." But then again, she's kind of going back and forth, because one, she has this underlying motivation, but two, she's been overly stimulated to a point where this sort of repressed sexuality is starting to emerge, to a point where she's almost becoming like another person, someone that's more, I guess you could say, basically, whereas she shied away from sexuality, prior to all this, it's kind of bringing, this wild side out of her, and not in a good way. And so they're having to contend with, that, but also with the fact that as much as, they want to and need to leave, they can't leave, because Pretorius, it turns out, once he's gotten a foothold into our dimension, is able to manipulate things from the other side, as in he's able to turn the machine on from the other side, even though it's been disengaged already. Like, he's able to, get, all the cords, plugged back in and turn it on from the other side in the dimension where he's at. And so, unfortunately, our, three main characters are in for a long haul of a nightmare. So yeah, From Beyond, it's a rather wild film, in a sense that there's a lot of chaos that ensues on screen, but I do like how there is a build up to it, in the sense that we know that there's something that's going to happen, but then once they first make contact with Edward Pretorius, there's like this initial eeriness that continues to permeate things, but then, once he starts, turning into this other, new life form or this other manifestation of things, that's when, the horror goes full on nightmare mode. And I gotta say that, for such a small cast in this movie, I thought that, all the main actors did a good job. I think that, Jeffrey Combs, it was interesting seeing him in kind of an inversion of the role he had in Reanimator, because in Reanimator, he was the mad scientist who wanted to keep on going regardless. But here, though, he's kind of like Bruce Abbott's character, or in some way, Barbara Crampton's own character, in a sense that he's, initially the more rational one, but he's also kind of the equivalent of a damsel in distress in some ways, or in some scenes. So it's interesting seeing that sort of inversion, but he did a pretty good job in the part. And I do like some of the aspects of his character where you get the idea that he was in a sort of toxic relationship with his mentor, and not necessarily saying that, the two of them had something going on between them, but at the same time, this mentor, his Dr. Pretorius, would basically kind of keep him around while he was, abusing, other women, because at one point, he's confiding in Bubba that Pretorius would, on their off nights, Pretorius would bring, all these beautiful women over to his place. Not, all at the same time, but like, almost every night he would bring a different woman over, and it would start off with fine wine, fine food, fine conversation, but it always ended screaming. So, basically, the videos and stuff that they saw in Pretorius's bedroom, I mean, yeah, the guy was a twisted individual before, before he was taken to the other side, and now, it's even worse. And so, Jeffrey Combs, I think, definitely had some good moments as, the character of Crawford, like especially with little monologues like that. I do think, though, that like as good as of an actor as he is, I do think that he unfortunately was overly theatrical at times, because it was kind of like it was like he was trying to be this new character that was for this movie, but he was kind of channeling the character of Herbert West, and Herbert West in Reanimator was kind of a theatrical character in some ways, and so in that movie that approach worked. But for the purposes of From Beyond, having Crawford be an overly theatrical character at times kind of clashed with the more organic approach that the other actors had in the movie. And so, I mean, as good as Jeffrey Combs is in the movie, I do think that if they had kept it on a more serious take, I think that his character would have been better for the movie, and I think Jeffrey Combs's performance would probably be better. In fact, like in the commentary track and in one of the interviews on the Blu-ray, he even mentions that, I mean, he had fun working on the movie, but he thinks that in hindsight they should have gotten someone like Bruce Abbott, who played the character of Dan Kane in Reanimator. And Dan was kind of the straight man to Herbert West's funny man, so to speak. And like he was the more rational character. He was the kind of guy who was kind of like, I mean, yeah, I am wanting to help mankind, through science and everything, but we've gone too far. Like he was that kind of character. And Bruce Abbott just had that sort of emotional gravitas that, was a lot more serious, and it worked in a more serious way. And so, Jeffrey Combs was pointing out that if someone like Bruce Abbott had his part in the movie, then he thinks that, the character of Crawford would have come across better. And so I think in hindsight, that would have been a better casting choice with respect to Jeffrey Combs, because, I mean, it would have been cool if Jeffrey Combs was in this movie regardless, but I think that having Bruce Abbott play his character would have been a better choice. So as far as Barbara Crampton goes, I gotta say that this is definitely one of the best performances of her career because, much like Jeffrey Combs, her character has an inversion in a sense that, in Reanimator, she was kind of a damsel in distress, although not one without substance. I mean, she was someone that was like a three-dimensional character that, we as an audience cared about. And so, but she was in danger, quite a bit, especially at the climax of that movie. But here, though, she is, in some ways, the danger in a sense that, she's the one who insists on, insists on continuing the experiment when, she and everyone else knows that this is a really bad idea. We need to hightail it now. But much like Herbert West, she just wants to continue regardless. Now, unlike Herbert West, her character actually does have a sympathetic backstory and a motivation that kind of does make sense, but it's the fact that she's being irresponsible about how to go about it, about seeing her goals come to fruition. And so she doesn't come across as a malevolent character, but a flawed one. And I do like how, the fact that the Resonator was acting as sort of like a drug almost, to all of them, but especially to her. And you see the fact that she had this sort of repressed sexuality that she just kept inside of her for so long, suddenly being brought out. And you get this memorable scene where she's in Pretorius's room, and she finds this dominatrix gear and puts it on, and she sort of starts to, have her way with, one of the characters who's asleep. And that in itself was kind of creepy, but there's also a certain sensuality and strength, with her character in the scene, because it's like she's asserting herself in a way that she ordinarily wouldn't be doing. But it's because of, what the Resonator is bringing out of her, like, because it's overstimulating her, she's wanting more. And so, you got the sensory, freak mindset, taking hold. And I thought, some people, it's like, you're thinking Barbara Crampton in a dominatrix outfit, that's, so much, mean material right there. But you see the movie, though, you see that part, and it's not necessarily played for laughs. And so it's creepy in a sense that she's, not exactly in control of herself, but she is giving in to, this repressed side of her, but and she's kind of having her way with someone who's asleep. So I guess rape by, I forgot what it's called, but when you rape someone and they're asleep or something like that. So it's creepy in that sense, but it's also kind of cool in the sense that you're seeing, her playing a woman who is taking charge sexually, for what may be the first time in her life, or at least you get the idea. And I thought Barbara Crampton did a good job of playing that, almost becoming a different person. And as far as Ken Foree goes, Ken Foree, of course, for those of you who are horror fans, was awesome in the George Romero classic Dawn of the Dead, the original. But here he's pretty good too, and he does a good job of playing big tough dude who is a nice guy and everything, very jovial fellow, but he makes it clear that hey, he's got, he's willing to push. If you're going to push him, he's going to push you, that kind of thing. Like, it's basically, don't take the nice guy for granted, don't excuse me, sorry, don't brush the nice guy off, or don't fall into the trap of not taking him seriously, because you try to do something funny, he'll put you down, or at the very least he'll restrain you, that kind of thing. So I thought he played well with Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs, and he definitely comes across as the more I'm sorry, he definitely comes across as the more level-headed of the three main characters, and basically he's the guy who has the most common sense of the group. And so and also I like the idea that even though he was susceptible to the emanations of the Resonator, I do like the idea that because of his profession and because of the fact that he's had to contend with, people who are junkies on the streets and what have you, in his job, he's in some ways got this almost inborn, or he's got this defense, against that kind of mindset that he's sort of built up over the years. And so even though he is affected by that, like, I mean, he gets, overly stimulated too, but he's able to sort of, keep it back or keep it at bay. Whereas the characters of Crawford and, Catherine are kind of, falling all over themselves, giving into it, and so, yeah, I mean, it was cool to see, Ken Foree, once again play a character of authority who has a genuine inner strength, except in this case, I mean, we're talking other dimensional stuff that he's having to contend with. And he has some funny lines too. I mean, especially the bit about, well, so-and-so wasn't in there with the amoeba, that kind of thing. But it's the right balance of, dark comedy and to go along with the horror. But overall, though, I mean, I think he was a good character, and he's definitely kind of like an audience surrogate in the sense that he didn't think anything wild like this was going to happen. Like, he was literally thinking it was just going to be a machine that has some crazy lights and that's it. But he was not thinking it was going to be there making contact with something from another dimension, let alone get attacked by something. And so his logic makes the most sense in the idea. The whole idea of them hightailing it out of there would have been a smart thing to do. So yeah, Ken Foree does a good job in this movie. As far as Ted Sorrell goes, he's the guy who plays Dr. Pretorius, and I don't think I've seen Ted Sorrell in anything. If I have, I don't remember. I'm sorry, but he was really good in this movie because, he has this sense of menace that he conveys, whether he's, human or whether he's, ever-changing monstrosity from in another, that's partially in another dimension. And, the fact that he had this sense of menace that he kept with him, whether it was just his human body or, encased in varying forms of latex, with the makeup and special effects and everything, it definitely showed his dedication to his part, because some people, it's kind of like, I mean, they might be able to convey a sense of menace, without makeup or anything like that. But then once the makeup's on them, some of that performance may be lost. But not the case with Ted Sorrell. And it was really cool to see, how, this character who was already, a deviant individual, just based on, what we saw of him as a person, and plus what Crawford had to tell of him, and then suddenly having all that darkness being turned up to 11 because now that he's no longer human. I mean, he has no need to hold back, and so he tends to be very scary in the scenes, like when he's attacking the group of the main characters, and especially poor Catherine. I mean, when he nearly has his way with her and everything. It's a scene that's not played for laughs, and some people might be like, if you're watching a trauma movie or something like that, and something like that were to happen, I mean, it'd probably be the monster spouting a bunch of one-liners and everything. But no, and this was like, I mean, yeah, I mean, he was cackling like a maniac the whole time with this more. He had this more booming laugh the whole time, but what he was doing to her was not funny. It was terrifying. And so, yeah, I mean, this was definitely a character that came across as a threat, and Ted Sorrell was a big reason for that, because he was able to portray that. Now, I do wish that there'd been something in the way of, say, maybe some flashbacks or something like that, or maybe some, some old video recordings of him and Crawford working together, because like I'm sure they had to have recorded their experiments and what have you. I think it would have been fascinating to see the character of Pretorius, as he was as a scientist, because then you'd see, okay, you'd get a better idea of like why he's so highly regarded in the scientific community, according to Catherine, and other people who've mentioned his name in the movie. But as we see him in the movie, though, he's just a sick what who just happened to hit on the right idea of building a machine that can help us to see into other dimensions, but it would have been interesting if we'd gotten to see him as the world saw him, as opposed to, say, right off the bat seeing him as a sexual deviant, because then I feel like that would have allowed for a gradual sense of revelation, so when, for example, Bubba and Catherine find his sex paraphernalia in his bedroom, that would have been kind of like a Law and Order moment of, oh yeah, this upstanding citizen had a dark side to them, that kind of thing. And then when we see him transformed into this other dimensional life form, I think that then seeing how twisted he was and how deviant he was in his personality, and then the revelation that he was always like that the whole time, and of course the whole monologue that Crawford had about him bringing the women over and the nights always ending in screaming. I think having that in would have helped too, or keeping that would have helped. But I think that a gradual sense of revelation of Pretorius being not such a good guy, I think would have made his character more believable. And to be sure, I mean, Ted Sorrell does a good job in the part, and Pretorius is a terrifying antagonist. But I just feel like there is something to be said for a subtle approach sometimes, and just seeing him fleshed out, like, say, the character of Catherine was, because while she does become, there are moments where she becomes an antagonist. I mean, it's not quite it's not quite within her control when it happens to her, but it's because of the resonator and everything. But there was a gradual sense of development in that regard for her character, whereas Pretorius, he was already like that, But I just think that, the whole idea of him being a pillar of the scientific community and everyone looking up to him, and, you're seeing, test footage of experiments, and you're seeing him being professional and courteous and everything, but then, you're starting to find out more and more about him, and then you find out, sure enough, I mean, he was not such a good guy after all. I just think that would have been more powerful as a sense of revelation, But as it is, I mean, Pretorius is a scary antagonist, and Ted Sorrell did a good job. Just I do wish that the sense of I wish there had been a more gradual sense of development for his character in terms of him going from one extreme to the other, as opposed to him already being at that extreme, if that makes sense. Also, you've got a really good score by Richard Band, and I liked his work on Reanimator, but I mean, like a lot of people who have seen the movie, I feel like his score for Reanimator was kind of a riff on the score for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I mean, it's a good score, but it definitely sounds like Psycho. Whereas here, the work he did in From Beyond definitely feels a lot more original. And there are musical beats that sort of, herald back to, or harken back to some of the, I guess, black and white horror films in some ways. But at the same time, it doesn't sound like dated or anything. It's like, it's that sort of classical intensity in, a movie with a bunch of, slime-covered monstrosities, but it's like that score, sort of, makes the movie that much more atmospheric, I felt. And on the other hand, the makeup and special effects were, really cool too. I liked how, when it came to, say, the fact that you had multiple monster creations on hand. I mean, you've got these, jellyfish creatures right here, and you got these, sort of, worm creatures right here with the sharp teeth. And you can't see it very well, but that big worm that was in the pool in the basement, the one with all the sharp teeth, it's sort of right there, and that's supposed to be its mouth, like around the characters. So it's like all the monster creations, like from the other dimension, look really cool. Very good use, very good prosthetic and makeup effects work for the creature creations. And when it comes to Edward Pretorius and the various forms he changes into, I thought that the makeup and special effects people did a wonderful job and pulled out all the stops, because every time Pretorius is on screen, it's in a different form. And even then, that form might change into something else, and usually in a very gruesome way. And you can tell that, the makeup and special effects people got some ideas from John Carpenter's The Thing, namely with the Rob Bottin's, groundbreaking, makeup and special effects work in that movie. But while they may have taken a page from The Thing, they definitely, didn't rip it off. They made it to where it's like, okay, we may have gotten some inspiration from here, but we're making this our own thing. And the, creature creations and, the, mutating form of Pretorius, I mean, are some examples of some wonderful makeup and, monster creations. And I mean, there's even a really, creepy but cool moment where it is in the scene wherein, he's, sort of having his way with Catherine, but you see one of his hands, he's holding one of his hands out, and you're seeing the fingers just kind of elongate. And from the standpoint of practical effects, that was creepy and cool, but it made the scene even more terrifying, considering what's going on. But yeah, so like the makeup and special effects in this movie were top notch, and I'm amazed at how well done they were, especially for a low budget movie and a low budget production company. Because I mean, Reanimator for sure had some good makeup and special effects, but at the same time, they weren't anywhere near as elaborate as the stuff you see on hand in this movie. So. So it's like at times you are aware that you're watching a low budget movie simply because of the limited locations, as well as the fact that most of the movie focuses on just 3 or 4 people, but at the same time, when it comes to the special effects go, you see where a lot of the money went, and it pays off. And because the monsters you see, the shifting body designs that you see, I mean, some wonderful example of practical creature effects and creations, and some awesome practical body horror special effects. So definitely top notch in this movie. I mean, there is one instance though where it's an otherwise really cool scene. It's when Pretorius's head, I mean, in one of his many forms, he detaches his head, it seems like, and it becomes like this almost pterodactyl-like creature. And the transformation scene itself is pretty cool, but then you see it flying at one of the characters, and it looks like a stop motion piece, which it wouldn't have been a problem if the rest of the special effects had also been kind of stop motion-esque. But considering it how fleshed out and organic everything looked as far as that went, this particular scene was very jarring. It was very much an eyesore, and it's one of those instances where for a little bit it kind of does take you out of the movie, or at least it took me out of the movie. And even on the commentary track, Stuart Gordon was saying, it's like, if there's one scene I would of this movie that I would redo, it's this one. And because he's pointing out the bad special effects for his shot of the pterodactyl creature flying at one of the main characters. And so other than that one scene though, I mean, what you see is really cool and very disturbing and terrifying, but awesome all at the same time. And I think the highlight though, I mean, of course, I mean, a good horror movie, you got to have a good climax, right? And at the climax, one of the coolest moments for me was you see 2 of the characters having merged and turned into this whole other life form that we haven't seen, something that we haven't seen on screen yet within this movie. And then you see them, basically fighting for control, like fighting each other for control. So it's like you're seeing them, reaching out from folds of the skin and tearing each other apart, and then the whole body just kind of turns inside out while they're fighting each other. And it's gruesome as all get out, but it looks amazing in terms of, say, practical makeup and special effects and creature creations and what have you. And there's also the third eye special effect, because one of the characters does have it happen to where, because of the emanations of the resonator and how much they've been exposed to it and the other dimensional frequencies and what have you, the third eye basically bursts out of their forehead, and it's a very gruesome scene. And you're seeing like this thing sort of like flitting around, looking around and everything, and then it sort of withdraws back into its head. But then this particular character, though, from then on, kind of becomes this, brain eating mutant, like this albino brain eating mutant that has moments of awareness and horror at what they're doing, but then they just can't stop. And so gruesome makeup and special effects, to be sure, in those scenes when they're chowing down on someone's brain. But then at the same time, you gotta give credit where it's due, because these were some good makeup and special effects, for especially to have like the third eye kind of flitting about and looking around, and it looks real too, especially for the time. So yeah, I mean, as far as like makeup and special effects and creature creations go, From Beyond is top notch in that regard. Okay. So I will say that this is one of those horror movies where, as cool as it is, there are so many moments where, you're looking at the screen like, get out of there, just run, just pack up and run, because, I mean, so many problems would have been solved if they had just hightailed it out of there after that first attempt at, making contact with the other side. And so there are moments where it's kind of frustrating in that regard, because, I mean, Ken Foree's character, I mean, is the one who's saying, hey, let's go, let's get out of here. And, and so it's like, dude, that's the guy from Dawn of the Dead. I think he knows what he's talking about. Let's go. But there are some mitigating circumstances to at least kind of explain why they're still there, instead of just hightailing out of there ASAP. Part of it was because, the resonator, you get the idea that it's basically turning them into sensory junkies, to a point where even if they know that it's the smart thing to do, they don't want to leave, because they've just got a dose of a remarkable high and they want more, even if they don't want to admit it. And, only the character of, Bubba, a guy who's been, a law enforcement officer and has seen some stuff on the streets. I mean, he's the one who picks up on it. And so so in that respect, you can kind of make the connection that the resonator is changing them and making it to where they don't want to leave, even if they could. And so that is kind of a mitigating factor, I think. On the other hand, there also is the idea that Pretorius has grown powerful enough, to manipulate things from the other side. A case in point, when he starts to turn the machine on and we see parts of it being put back together by itself, and that's him from the other side, making it happen. And you get the idea that if they had just left the resonator destroyed like Crawford had left it the night that Pretorius was killed, then it's very possible that Pretorius would never have been able to come back. But, excuse me, But because they turned the machine, they repaired the machine and turned it back on, that allowed for Pretorius to get a foothold into our dimension. And so you could make the argument that, had they, just left it off after that first encounter with Pretorius, then it's possible that, they could have still hightailed it out of there, or, the resonator was still, been beyond his control. But then again, when Catherine turns it back on, and she has it on for much longer than they had it the first time, you could make the argument that because it was turned on for longer, that gave Pretorius enough time to get some kind of foothold into our dimension. But then again, you could also make the argument that just the fact that they repaired the resonator and turned it back on in the first place was all Pretorius needed to get a foothold into our dimension and turn the machine back on from the other side, even if the main characters had disengaged everything, like, and pulled all the cords and what have you. So as frustrating as it is for the characters to not hightail it out of the place, I mean, when it's the smartest thing to do, or at the very least, they should have, brought in, more than one security person. They should have brought in, more than just, Detective, Bubba, right? I mean, as cool of a character as he is, I mean, you're kind of like, okay, we're going to need some more badass personnel on hand here, just in case things go south. And sure enough, they do go south. Or the idea of them taking the resonator to a more secure facility and where there's more safeguards and a more controlled environment. I mean, all those ideas, I think, would have made a lot more sense, and it would have been cool to see those ideas carried out. I mean, I'm all for a horror movie in a confined setting, and From Beyond works in that respect. But at the same time, the whole idea of say, the equivalent of, or I should say, an equivalent of, like soldiers, like in the movie Aliens, showing up here as kind of added security. I mean, that would have been cool to see, to see them, like, because it would have shown, like, hey, there's some intelligence here, in the sense that we're not just sending one guy to keep an eye on things and have your back in case this experiment turns out to work, but also it was just shown that hey, there's there's more of a defensive measure in place against these monsters, and also it would have been interesting to see the whole idea of the resonator being taken from the house and into a facility where it's a more controlled place. And it would have been cool to see, like, okay, could a controlled environment have at that point done any good, or was it too late already, since Pretorius had already had a foothold in our dimension once the resonator was already repaired and turned back on. So I guess that's a sign of a good movie in a way, because on one hand, there is a flaw there, but your mind kind of comes up with ways to explain the flaw and why it's present, and why it stays in the movie, as opposed to that was just a stupid idea, that kind of thing. So I guess, I mean, it's a flaw, but the movie's good enough to where you can try and come up with your own explanation as to why certain characters don't do the most logical thing. And I appreciate it when a movie is that well made to where you're compelled to think like that. But yeah, and I do think that okay, so while I do think that having watched this movie when I'm older, and when I've had a more in way of life experience, I mean, the link between dark psychology and sexuality, I mean, I can appreciate it more, and how it's depicted on screen here. But at the same time, the way it's done in some instances, I felt like, I mean, regardless of, how much in a way of sophistication or maturity it's done with, or at the very least as gruesome as it's conveyed on screen with the body horror, there are moments though where I feel like some horror audiences, I mean, might be turned off by it. Like even people who like horror movies might be disturbed at some moments in this movie in terms of, say, how scenes of sexuality are conveyed, especially with what happens with Barbara Crampton's character and what have you. So just be aware, if sexual violence or disturbing portrayals of sexuality are a problem, you might not, want to watch this movie. You just might want to, pass on it. But if you do watch this movie, just bear in mind that those elements are there, but they can be something that are harsh at times. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give From Beyond 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, and it's one of those things that, first time I watched it, wasn't a fan, but the second time, it was actually pretty good. And just because it was made by a lot of the same people that did Reanimator doesn't mean it's going to be Reanimator, but that also doesn't mean it's going to be a bad movie. So, excuse me, sorry. But yeah, so From Beyond, 4 out of 5 stars. Good horror film. And as far as special features go, it's got a pretty good set, and the special features are on both the Blu-ray and DVD, which I really appreciate. But you've got a really good audio commentary by director Stuart Gordon, and stars Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton. And anytime these people are in a room together, you're going to have a good time. Whether it's an interview, whether it's a commentary track, these three people, are, have basically become friends, and while they were working together. And so while you're watching the movie and listening to the commentary track, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that, they talk about in terms of, say, how the movie was made or how certain parts of the movie were made, or little behind the scenes anecdotes, but also just the friendly chemistry they have with one another as people is really, nice to see, or, it makes for a good listen. And one of the interesting things that I found out in the commentary was that in the script, there were moments, where they wanted to have it to where, this other dimension was basically making its way even further into our dimension than it was on screen, like than the movie showed. There was supposed to be a moment where towards a climax, I think it was in the part where like all this other dimensional violet waters cascading down the staircase. Like there's supposed to be a moment, I think it was at that scene where the characters, they go into another room, and you once again, there's like all this water and everything, and all these worms floating around or swimming around there. But there's also this pyramid like structure that's risen up out of the water, and it's like this other dimensional landscape that briefly makes its way into our reality. And the visual I got in my head was it was like in this, there was a horror movie called The Void. And if you get a chance, check it out. I think it came out in like 2019, but don't quote me. But it's definitely Lovecraft inspired for sure. But there's like a scene involving this pyramid like structure, and that's the visual I got from what Stuart Gordon was talking about in the commentary track. And the way it was described, I mean, I would have loved to have seen that in the movie. I mean, I imagine it would have been a little more expensive, to have a special effects sequence involving like, a pyramid, and an alien landscape making our way into our reality in a small room. But it would have been really cool to see. It would have, added further to the Lovecraftian atmosphere, other dimensional stuff. So you also have a really neat interview with Barbara Crampton, and of course she talks about her career and everything, but especially the impact that stuff like Reanimator and From Beyond had on her career, and overall, like, she enjoyed her time with the movie on these movies, and she enjoys her status as a scream queen. But she also was talking about how there have been a few times where some friends of hers thought it'd be cute to show one of those movies at a party or something, and she's talking about how sometimes it's a little awkward, but after a couple of glasses of champagne, it's all fun. So she has a good sense of humor about the whole thing, but she does enjoy her time. She did enjoy her time in those movies, and she enjoyed her time working with Jeffrey Combs and Stuart Gordon and Ken Foree, and basically you get an idea, you get a portrait of an actress who is content with her status as a horror icon. And you also have an interview with Jeffrey Combs, and it's once again it's an interview that he talks about amongst other things. I mean, he does appreciate, he did enjoy his time on the movie, but as I mentioned earlier, he does think that the movie would have been better if Bruce Abbott from Reanimator had played his part in the movie instead of him. So I mean, all in all, I mean, it's a good interview. And then you have the director's perspective, and it's a featurette with Stuart Gordon, and then you also have the editing room, Lost and Found featurette, and it talks about how some of the scenes of blood and gore were kind of hard to reinstate back into the movie, because this is actually the unrated version. But there was a scene with one of the characters who's been mutated, and is the one that's got a hankering for human brains all of a sudden. But the scene where they're sucking the brains out of this other character's eye, or where out of the hole where the eye once was, that scene was actually cut, or at least parts of the scene were cut to where it's like it wasn't explicit, but it talks about how they had to go through some trouble to find the footage and reinstate it into the movie, and so it definitely makes the scene all that more disturbing. Then you got an interview with the composer Richard Band, and it's a pretty good interview. If you're a music buff, I mean, it's cool to listen to. I mean, I'm not a music aficionado, but at the same time, I understood enough to where it's like, okay, yeah, it's a good interview. Photo gallery, storyboard to film comparisons with an introduction. And so all in all, I mean, you got some good supplemental material on this Blu-ray / DVD pack, or this Blu-ray DVD combo pack. And so you have good bonus material for a good movie. And but yeah, that was From Beyond. If you like 80s horror films, or just films where you have a lot of practical makeup and special effects on hand, definitely check out From Beyond. And if you're a Stuart Gordon fan, or Jeffrey Combs fan, or if you like Barbara Crampton or Ken Foree, I mean, it's definitely worth checking out, because all those actors are good, and this is definitely a good film that came out of Stuart Gordon's output, or it's a good film that came from Stuart Gordon, and it's not great like Reanimator, but it is a good movie. So From Beyond, 4 out of 5 stars. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So you all have a good night. Take care. Bye.